Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 304 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. Now, this episode is one where I'm going to ask you the question, is leadership simply about finding the right balance? Thinking face emoji or something like that. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about balance in leadership and why I'm increasingly starting to think that leadership is really about finding balance amongst a bunch of different elements and seeing where you sit in that balance and acting and reflecting accordingly to improve the way you lead. So I'm going to unpack more about this concept right now. So what I've noticed when I'm dealing with leadership situations myself and coaching thoughtful leaders is there's usually a happy medium to be struck in almost any sort of leadership situation. So let me give you an example. All right. If you're at work and you're working with your team and you show vulnerability, right? You confide in your team that, well, I'm a bit worried about this, or maybe this problem's really frustrating me. There's a nice degree of vulnerability where you confide in your team, those emotions, that will build trust with your team because they will see you as a real person and they'll appreciate the fact that you have been open and honest with them about how you're feeling. However, if you were so open with your emotions that you kept confiding in people every 5 minutes and people started to see that you were very, very worried and you were always telling them how frustrated you were with your boss and all these things, that's probably too much vulnerability and you will lose credibility and respect of your team. On the other hand, if you don't show any vulnerability, so you never confide in your team about what you're feeling, you never share your emotions or your thoughts, then they might see you as a bit of a closed book. And that can mean people don't feel comfortable coming to you or approaching you with different things. And therefore, you might lose that credibility or trust with your team as well because they think you're, keeping things all to yourself or keeping everything inside and not being open and honest. So that's where I'm talking about the balance, right? The balance is a happy medium in the middle somewhere, which is, well, I want to show a little bit of vulnerability with my emotions, but I don't want to go overboard and completely be so open and honest that people lose credibility for me. And I don't want to be a closed book where I don't confide in anyone and talk about my feelings or what I'm thinking at any given time. So that's where I'm talking about finding the balance. And there's a bunch of different examples I've got here, which I'm just going to run through around different areas where I think balance is so important in leadership. So another one is giving autonomy to your team. So there's a certain degree where we want to give a lot of freedom to our team. We want to let them make decisions about the work that they do. We want them to be able to make their own choices and maybe take a few risks about different approaches they might use. And that's great because it can improve motivation. Now, the flip side of that is if we give no autonomy to our team, we are basically micromanaging them. We're telling them exactly what to do at all times. We're not giving them any freedom, and therefore they feel stifled and unmotivated. So once again, there's a happy medium here because sometimes you want to be able to tell people what they should be doing and give them specific direction, but you also want to be able to give them some freedom and autonomy as well. Once again, it's a balance. Because if you give people too much freedom, they might do silly things or they might make mistakes or they might ignore that important safety compliance requirement that is there for a reason. So you can't just give people complete freedom, nor can you stifle them by giving them no freedom. So once again, it's about balance. Another example, holding people accountable. So it's important to hold people accountable and to raise feedback about poor performance and those sort of things. And this might include having difficult conversations. So obviously, if you avoid difficult conversations all the time, then you won't be able to hold people accountable and they won't be aware of the issues that they may be causing, and therefore they're not getting that feedback. So that's a problem. However, if you are having difficult conversations when you see the slightest little issue, then You may be perceived as jumping at shadows. You might be really engaging too closely with your team in terms of having these hard conversations when maybe they're not needed. So, once again, there's a balance here. We want to basically decide the times where we should jump in and have a difficult conversation, give that feedback, and other times where we need to pull back and say, you know what, it's not a big problem for now. I'm just going to see how things go. So, once again, all about balance. Another situation, the last one I'll cover here, is when it comes to helping and supporting your team. And I see this a lot with thoughtful leaders where they are in a people pleasing mode. And thoughtful leaders can sometimes fall into that people pleasing category. Now, people pleasers can be great because they help support the team and they really care about other people. And I think that makes for good leadership. However, once again, guess what I'm going to say here? That's right, there's some kind of balance required. So if you are supporting your team with every problem they have and you're being 100% available for your team, then you may be being too helpful and they start to rely on you all the time as like a crutch. They basically come to you all the time and they expect you to solve their problems. And what can happen is they don't start to fend for themselves and solve their own issues and think proactively or be proactive. And so, if you're too much of a helpful leader and too available for your team, that can cause problems. Obviously, the other extreme is also bad as well. When you are not available and you're not helping your team and you're getting them to fend for themselves completely, they might feel unsupported and therefore unmotivated, and they might make mistakes and all those bad things. So, once again, it's all about balance here, whether you support your team or you give them freedom and therefore develop their proactiveness and their ability to think for themselves. So, as you can see, there's lots of situations here, and I've got about 5 more written in front of me here, but I'm not going to talk about all of them. There's so many situations where a balanced approach is necessary. And this is partially why I get really annoyed when I see things about leadership that are just cut and dried. Like, people like to talk about leadership sometimes in little one-liners. They say things like, oh, leaders eat last, or servant leadership is the best way, all this sort of stuff. It really frustrates me, I'll be honest with you, because these sort of one-liners, these throwaway statements, lack any nuance. So if someone say, Simon Sinek wrote the famous book, Leaders Eat Last, and the main concept here is basically that you should put your team first and support your team first, because then you'll build that trust and you don't use your positional power. You basically put the team's need first, because if your team aren't feeling good, they won't do the good work for you and they won't be committed to you as well. Now, some people, however, take this leaders eat last concept too literally, as in they treat it as, well, I should look after my team and help everyone else before I help myself. I'm actually a big believer in making sure you look after yourself so that you are in a better position to help your team. Because if you're not feeling good, you won't be doing your good leadership, or good leadership if I'm going to use proper English. And so this is where these one-liners of leadership really annoy me like that, because they're not nuanced. So there's always a balance here, right? There's a balance. Leaders eat last. Yeah, well, maybe sometimes the leader needs to look after themselves so they're in a better position to look after their team because they have better energy and confidence. And so it's not always so cut and dried as what people have you believe. So what do we do with this information? Well, I think it's useful to identify in given situations where you sit in this balance or on the spectrum. So if you're a real people pleaser, you might find yourself erring on the side of, in your default style, you might find you're always too helpful, you're trying to be too available for your team. Or you might be the opposite, where maybe you're not available for your team and you're more of a results-focused person who's not so supportive. So it's important to identify where you sit along the balance, right? The other thing, if you're giving autonomy to your team, maybe you're a leader who gives heaps of freedom to your team, or maybe you're a leader who tends to be a bit worried and micromanages your team. So once again, you're trying to identify, okay, where do you sit along the balance? And how do you identify this sort of stuff? Well, a lot of it, you can use psychometric tools. I use the print assessment, which is a nice one. But you can use other, profiling tools like DISC or like EQI2, Emotional Intelligence Assessment. Gallup Strengths Finder is quite a good one as well. So you can use psychometric tools if you have them available to you. But I also think personal reflection, like structured reflection, is a great way to identify where you sit on the balance in various situations. Now, you might know I've got my useful thinking journal, which you can see on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/304. The useful thinking journal is a little digital and physical journal tool that I created to help you reflect on situations in a structured way and build confidence to move forward with them and find out what you could do better or what you did well already and keep doing those things. And so, yeah, check that tool out. But I find personal reflection really valuable because taking the time to reflect on how you handled given situations can be a really valuable thing. And then I think what it's about is tracking progress and tracking any trends you notice. And this is where the useful thinking journal can also be helpful. Basically thinking about, what are the situations where you find yourself people pleasing too much or maybe avoiding difficult conversations, trying to identify trends around your personal leadership style, and then making a commitment to self-correcting and making sure you try to remind yourself, hey, I've got to show that balance. I've got to find the balance in my leadership. And you'll notice that the balance will change depending on the individual you're leading at the time. So different team members have different requirements and, the situation in general. So when you are in the middle of an emergency, for example, you don't have time to give freedom to your team. It's all about saying, hey, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. It's no use if there's a fire in the building, there's no point going, okay, everyone, let's gather around and how do we like to get out of the fire today? No, we give a direction and we get people to follow us out the door. So there will be different times where the balance of your leadership needs to change, but it's really useful to help you see where you sit on that spectrum so that you can adjust, self-correct, and track your progress over time. So yeah, the Useful Thinking Journal is one tool you can use to do that. Otherwise, if you want to make it really simple, you could get a notepad out and say, what did I do well this week? Where did I struggle? What would I do differently next time? That can be as simple as that as well. So any sort of personal reflection you can do, and also these personality assessment or psychometric tools can be very useful as well. Try to identify where you sit along the balance of this spectrum. I'm interested in your comments on this topic. What do you think about this balance topic? Is it true that there's balance needed in all things, or am I making things up here? Give me your thoughts on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/304. I'd love to hear what you think. And by the way, if you like this podcast, I would love you to be able to leave a positive review on your podcast app of choice. They usually do a star rating these days, so 5 stars would be awesome. You can do that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or, the app you like best. It really helps me get the word out about the podcast. I have asked you a few times before. I appreciate you doing that. If you've done that already, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking that time. So leave a comment on the show notes page about this balance topic. I'm interested to hear what you think. Keep up with the thoughtful leadership as usual. Keep your leadership at the right balance, which is obviously tricky, and I'll be back next week.